Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs. Mon nom est Hamid Georgiani et en ma qualité de président de ce groupe de réflexion sur le Moyen-Orient, c'est un grand plaisir de vous accueillir et vous souhaiter la bienvenue au 16e événement de notre programme pour cette saison. As we begin, I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the unceded territory of the Algonquin people, the traditional territory of the Wendat and the Haudenosaunee. May we honor the indigenous stewards of this land and grow in right relationship with all indigenous peoples. Et maintenant, permettez-moi de vous présenter notre conférencière distinguée, Madame Barbara Slavin. Barbara is the director of the Future of Iran Initiative and a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. She's also a lecturer in international affairs at George Washington University. As you may know, Barbara is the author of the book entitled Bitter Friends, Bosom Enemies, Iran and the US, and the Twisted Path to Confrontation, which was published in 2007. She's a distinguished journalist and she has had a very honorable relationship with the Washington Times, USA Today, The Economist, the New York Times Week in Review, and many others. She has also written several reports, and the one which is I have in my list is Mullah's Money and the Militants, How Iran Exerts Its Influence in the Middle East. So it's a distinct honor to have you, Barbara. And without further delay, the microphone is yours.
Well, thank you, Hamid. It is a complete pleasure, and I'm very grateful for this invitation. I have many good friends in Canada, and we were talking earlier, particularly about Canadian diplomats who I've known in my postings overseas, particularly in Cairo and the Middle East and in other places as well. And as an American journalist, I always found that Canadian diplomats were incredibly knowledgeable and usually more forthcoming than their American counterparts. So I've always been very grateful for those relationships. I'll talk a little bit about how I got interested in Iran. I wasn't an Iran scholar from birth. I actually studied Russian in college, and Iran, however, was a country that always interested me. And when I became a journalist, I was working for the New York Times, which had a section, the Week in Review, that summarized the major news of the week. I was part of a team of two people who had a column called The World. And for some reason, I was given the Middle East. And the timing, I guess, was fortuitous because from 1978 through 1981, I think I wrote a column about Iran almost every week. First, it was the revolution and all of the incredibly dramatic events leading up to the overthrow of the Shah. And then shortly thereafter, there was the hostage crisis and the holding of American diplomats for 444 days. So I became very familiar with Iranian politics from afar, with the names, with the ideology of the revolution. In the 80s, my husband and I moved to Cairo, and we covered the Iran-Iraq War, other burning topics in the Middle East, the Iran-Contra scandal. Some of you may remember when the United States surreptitiously sold weapons to Iran, overcharged it, and used the money to support anti-communist guerrillas in Central America, all the while giving intelligence aid to the Iraqis, really playing both sides of the fence. Subsequently, I came back to the United States and got a job with the paper USA Today as their diplomatic correspondent. In 1996, I was asked to do a piece on the status of women in the Muslim world because the Taliban had just consolidated power in Afghanistan. And of course, there were horrible stories about what they were doing to women in that country. So my editor at the time and I said, well, I'll go back to Cairo. I knew Cairo well. I knew about the women's situation in Cairo. And I said, why don't I go to Iran? I've always wanted to go there and I never got the chance. So my first trip was in 1996, and it blew my mind away. What can I say? I don't know how many in the audience are from Iran or have had the opportunity to go there, but it was so different from the stereotype of women in black and dreariness and death to America and death to Israel. I found a very vibrant society with people leading extremely interesting private lives. And also the politics of the time was much more interesting. This was a year before Mohammed Khatami was elected president and ushered in a period of at least attempts at reforming the political system in Iran. It was a time when Iran was looking to connect with the West. And we can talk about whether that's still the case. But anyway, I was able to go, and subsequently I was able to return to Iran 9 times for visits of a week, 2 weeks, a little more sometimes, but over a period of every other year. So I was able to see the evolution of the politics and the society. Now, the politics, unfortunately, is going backwards in Iran. I think we have a regime that is more repressive than ever. But the society has changed. And that's something that I think a lot of people in the United States, certainly, and in Canada perhaps as well, don't appreciate, that Iranians are plugged in. They are very aware of what is going on outside. There are methods of getting around government censorship, various computer apps, that allow Iranians really to tap into events all around the world. And people are extremely lively. The latest innovation is something called Clubhouse, which is a new app for use just with iPhones. And I think there's also a way to use it with other kinds of phones. And you have sometimes 2,000 people on a call debating Iranian government officials and others about the policies of the Islamic Republic. Now, this app will probably be blocked after the Iranian elections in June, but for now, it's an interesting window into the politics and the views of people in Iran. Now, I follow US-Iran diplomacy very closely. My book was largely about missed opportunities between the US and Iran for a more normal relationship. I really thought we were getting somewhere with the Iran nuclear deal of 2016. But as you all know, President Trump decided to quit this agreement, even though Iran was in compliance with it at the time. And he put sanctions back, and he added more sanctions and more sanctions. The US and Iran came perilously close to actual war. When there were attacks on Americans in Iraq and the US Embassy. And then the Trump administration decided to assassinate the head of the Quds Force, the elite force of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, Qasem Soleimani, in early 2020. Fortunately, it did not deteriorate or escalate into full-scale war, but the tensions were very high, and they remain high even after the inauguration of Joe Biden. We have talks now in Vienna, which are indirect. The Europeans are acting as go-betweens between the United States and Iran to see if this nuclear agreement can be salvaged. And I'm hopeful that if that is accomplished, that we will be able to see other discussions about other issues. I think already we can talk about Israel. This is a separate issue, but certainly in terms of Iran-Saudi relations, Iran-Emirati relations, we have seen a de-escalation there. The Iraqis are actually hosting talks between Iran and Saudi Arabia, between intelligence officials from these two countries. And ideally, this will lead to a de-escalation of the kinds of tensions that we've seen between these two major Middle East powers. But Iran, it's the experience of Trump and seeing the US pull out from this deal and reimpose sanctions has obviously vindicated those in Iran who don't trust the West and who see that Iran's future is somehow more with China and Russia. with autocratic regimes and not with Western democracies. And it may be that this is the path that Iran will follow. I hope not, and maybe this is my last remark before we get to your questions. I think one reason why a look east policy on the part of the Islamic Republic won't work, it's because of the huge diaspora, which is all in the West. It's in the United States, Canada, Europe, Australia. This is where Iranians go when they leave the Islamic Republic. They don't go to China. They don't go to Russia. And I think that provides some sort of assurance that there will always be an interest in better ties with the West. I think Iranians by nature also are looking to the West intellectually, culturally, much more than they're looking toward other repressive regimes. So that's a card we have to play. And we will see how long it takes to get back to some sort of normal diplomacy. I believe Canada still has not reopened its embassy in Tehran, which is a great misfortune. You had some really excellent people in your embassy there when I used to visit. Normalization with the United States, of course, is trickier, but I'm hopeful that even that will eventually happen, perhaps after the Iranian elections, if so-called hardliners consolidate power and get the presidency as well. Maybe they'll feel less paranoid about having some sort of relationship with the United States that can't be exploited perhaps by their internal competitors, which has been the case really for the last 20 years. So maybe let me stop there. I can take this in any direction that you want. And although I'm not an expert on Israel-Palestine, I am also happy to comment a little bit about that situation if you like.
Thank you very much for the overview. And it was interesting because there were a number of key topics or keywords in your assessment. And it was very interesting that you went through the whole history from the time when the changes occurred in Iran. Just for the sake of clarification, I'm inviting our participants to submit their questions through our Q&A. And to the extent possible, we'll try to address all of them. But it was interesting the way you described Khatami's willingness for rapprochement, and also you used the term, hopefully the Iranians would be less paranoid. I guess the most important thing in this assessment, the general assessment of the relationship, is that during Khatami, there was a genuine desire to reach out some sort of a rapprochement. And I recall that even His Excellency President Moshe Katsav of Israel, who was from the same city as President Khatami, they were keenly interested in a general rapprochement. And in Persian, they say ashti. Ashti means, well, reconciliation. And unfortunately, there were elements, I think, in Washington and perhaps in Tel Aviv that were not ready for that. And that created a bad taste in everybody's mouth in Tehran. And it is because of that and the whole history of the bad treatment of Persians during the Great Game and subsequently World War I, that has created this visceral distrust of the West. And how do you see that? How can we resolve that in the process that is going on right now indirectly with Iran?
Yeah, look, it's very difficult. One of the most unfortunate aspects of the Trump administration, beyond quitting this nuclear deal, imposing sanctions and so on, is that regime change became really the policy of the US government. It wasn't always stated that way, but it was very clear from the statements of officials like John Bolton, who was briefly the National Security Advisor, Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, that they wanted the overthrow of the Iranian government and that they hoped that the policy of sanctions, so-called maximum pressure, would bring that about, that Iranians would be so immiserated under so much pressure that they would rise up against the government. Of course, what they didn't understand was that this economic pressure made that less likely when people are struggling to survive on a daily basis. They don't have much energy for political movements. So it's really a very cruel and cynical policy, in my view, perhaps dictated more by domestic politics in the United States, by certain groups in this country that are vehemently opposed to the Islamic Republic, primarily because of its policies toward Israel, which are hostile. And this is one of the root causes, I think, of the animosity between the United States and Iran as it's developed over the last 20 years in particular. So, what is it going to take? I mean, the Iranians are going to have to, I think, acknowledge the reality of Israel. They may continue to support the Palestinian cause, but chanting death to Israel at rallies and continuing to provide weapons to Hamas and Hezbollah and Palestinian Islamic Jihad is not a way to win hearts and minds, certainly in Israel, but it's also not a way to win hearts and minds in the United States. This is the basis for Iran's designation as a state sponsor of terrorism, one of, I think, only 3 countries left on this list. Now, you can't dictate to a country what its policies are going to be, and the United States has supported governments and non-state actors that have very checkered human rights policies, Saudi Arabia among them. And Israel to some extent now, as we see the devastation that is going on in Gaza. But this has been really the major impediment, in my view, to a US-Iran relationship. So my hope is that if we can restore this nuclear agreement, then we can begin to talk about the other issues that divide us, human rights among them, and also Iran's policies in the region, its support of the Assad regime, its support of Hezbollah, Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, militias in Iraq, the Houthi rebels in Yemen. Is there a way to change that or tone it down? And when I spoke about paranoia, I mean, it's not paranoid because the Trump administration really was trying to overthrow the regime. So perhaps Biden can somehow convince the Iranian government that this is not the US objective and that we actually want some sort of relationship with Iran, and that we are looking to have policies that benefit all the people in the region and that are not just in support of this country or that country. There are a lot of things we can talk about, and there are a lot of ways in which we can help each other, but we have to get over, I think, the hurdle first of a return to the JCPOA and then see where we are.
Thank you. In fact, you have addressed a number of questions here that I see. One was pertaining to the relationship between Iran and Israel, and one of the questioners indicated that Iran is one of the only countries in the Middle East that has a rich history of collaboration or friendship with Israel, which goes back thousands of years. And then the human rights issue that you raised was another question here, which you very eloquently suggested that let's see what happens to JCPOA negotiations. And once that happens, we could address the human rights issues in Iran as well. And then there is another question, which is how strong is the desire for political change among the Iranian people today? And I think you spoke about that, but could you just briefly touch on
Sure.
these 3 topics?
Sure. And I don't mean to say that human rights has to wait for the JCPOA to be restored. I think this is something we need to speak out on all the time because I mean, the number of political prisoners in Iran, the treatment of journalists, of the labor movement, of religious minorities, it's terrible. And I personally have a friend who is in prison in Iran, has been for 5 years, for the crime of trying to improve US-Iran relations, a man named Siamak Namazi. And there are others, dual nationals and others. There are wonderful human rights defenders like Nasrin Sotoudeh, lawyers who are in jail for defending clients charged with various offenses. And we should never ignore this, and we should always continue to speak out on these issues. but that doesn't mean we can't talk about other things as well. And I do think that my understanding of the dynamics in Iran is that we don't really, while we've got Iran under sanctions, which are kind of mass punishment of the society, it actually reduces our standing to talk about human rights in general. We have to stop this punishment of innocent people. And for that, we need to get back into the JCPOA and hopefully build on it with perhaps a new nuclear agreement that extends some of the provisions in the deal. The mention of Iran-Israel, I mean, yes, under the Shah, of course, relations were very close, and Jews have lived in Iran for 5,000 years. There's still 10, 15,000 of them living in the country. I was joking with some people earlier today. I mean, the fact that the Iranian government is all in supporting the Palestinians now. Iranian people are not terribly attracted to what they call Arab causes, and as non-Arabs, they see themselves as very distinct from that. And I always say that when I went there, I was surprised that I found Iranians were, yes, they were anti-Semitic. They very much disliked Arabs, but not so much Jews. And there are many Iranian Jews who are in Israel, and Iranians listen to the, Persian language radio station that is broadcast from Israel, and they go and see their relatives. They go to Cyprus or Turkey or Greece and go and see their relatives who live in Israel. So I think there's still a lot of close connections, cultural connections, historic connections between Jews and Persians, but the governments get in the way.
That is true. I think we see that. We see the signs, the Esther story, the Purim story, which is being completely converted into a different type of a, I won't say bal masqué, but it is different from what I used to hear from my Jewish friends in Iran. And the point is that Iranians are not anti-Semitic. This should be recorded.
Let's put it that way.
No, this should be recorded, because the fact that there are so many synagogues in Iran openly practicing what they do every day indicates that people have no anti-Semitic feelings. There have been differences. I remember in the earlier times, every time the Israeli football team came to Tehran, people were agitated because they were saying that, look at all those European players, they're playing for Israel. This is not fair. But other than that, and of course, there is a history of ill treatment of the Israelis, but in most of the cases, I mean, not Israelis, the Jewish Iranians, it was instigated by foreign agents. For example, during the World War I tragedy that happened in Iran, the genocide of Persians, 9 to 11 million passed away. There was a group in US that started sending aids, but the aids that they were sending was totally designated for areas where there were predominantly Jewish Iranian. And that created, in this starvation, that created a lot of agitation, because how would they have it and we won't have it? People were desperate. Anyway, now I'm moving to a question from a diplomat, a Canadian diplomat, a distinguished Canadian diplomat. How realistic are future efforts, not now, to discuss limitations on Iranian support for Hezbollah, Syria, and Hamas? And what are your views regarding restrictions on Iranian ballistic missiles?
Okay. Well, these are very difficult issues. Although so much of the emphasis has been on Iran's nuclear program, in fact, nuclear weapons are not really essential to Iran's defense strategy as it's evolved over the last 40 years. Iran has made a virtue out of its lack of conventional power by supporting these proxy groups. And there's an ideological component, there's a national security component to it, that Iran sees groups like Hezbollah as protecting it, deterring against an Israeli or an American attack. If Israel were to attack the Iranian homeland, then Hezbollah would unleash rockets on Israel. So I think these are more difficult questions, and I'm not sure that we can negotiate away some of these relationships, particularly the relationship with Hezbollah. On missiles, I think there are possibilities for some regional understandings. And a lot of us are looking to ideas for perhaps some sort of meeting of the Gulf Cooperation Council members and Iraq and Iran, a kind of 6+2, if you will, where they could talk about accepting limitations on the range of missiles, the types of missiles deployed. Iran has these missiles, uses them primarily, has used them against Saudi Arabia, against US forces in Iraq, against shipping in the Persian Gulf. But if it could reach an understanding, maybe the UN could be the instigator for this kind of conversation. I think Iran would be willing to accept some limits on its ballistic missile force, perhaps some arrangements for guaranteeing the security of the Persian Gulf, of the freedom of navigation in the Persian Gulf. I think Iran will also be willing to be helpful on Yemen. And these talks that have been going on between the Saudis and the Iranians in Iraq are dealing in part with Yemen, which is a huge threat to Saudi Arabia. And Iran has provided some technology, some assistance to the Houthis. So I can see a kind of ratcheting down of tensions there. Syria is a tougher issue. I mean, it looks as though Assad is there to stay. And we also have other countries, frankly, Turkey has intervened massively also in Syria and has a big area of influence with Turkish troops in it. US is still there in alliance with Kurdish groups. So, the Russians are still there and want to keep that relationship. So this is complicated. The Syrians are about to have elections, but they'll be phony elections, and Assad, I'm afraid, will be re-elected. And the question is, how do we help the Syrian people? How do we help all the refugees, the millions of people who've been displaced? Is there any way to bring justice to those who've committed atrocities, frankly, against the people of Syria, including Iranians who've participated in these atrocities? But this is a long-term issue. Lebanon, Hezbollah has only become more powerful over the years. And the more we do to try to somehow limit Hezbollah's power, the more it seems to increase. So these are long-term issues that we're going to have to work on, and they're going to take a tremendous amount of creativity. They're going to take back channel negotiations, track 2 talks. Under the Obama administration, there were talks between former Iranian officials and former Israeli officials, former heads of the Mossad, former Iranian diplomats. And there were efforts to really talk about what would be required so that Israel would not see Iran as such a threat, and vice versa. We have to admit also that the leadership of Israel, that Bibi Netanyahu, has made his career off demonizing Iran. And sometimes that's been justified, and sometimes it's been total hyperbole. Israel has done a lot of damage to Iran. It's killed over a half a dozen Iranian scientists. It's attacked Iran's nuclear infrastructure repeatedly. It's attacked Iran in Syria and in Iraq, Iranian personnel, military personnel, weapons transfers, weapons factories. Now, you may say Israel is entitled to do this because of Iran's attitude toward Israel, but it's certainly not guaranteed to win the hearts and minds of Iranians. So how do we unwind this and convince these 2 countries that they no longer have to have each other as enemies? This is going to be a long-term project.
Thank you. And your observation is very true in the sense that when you look at the events that have occurred, it is primarily the damages that have been caused by Mr. Netanyahu's administration. I mean, every time they have tried to open a door, he has closed it with some very heavy-handed reaction. But on the other hand, as you said correctly, there are many in the past administrations that know each other very well. I have a friend in Toronto who was a pilot in the Iranian Air Force, and he had a number of friends from Israel. They went to training in Texas together, and they were in touch. We went to a wedding, and he found one of his friends. It was a joint Persian, the two communities from Israel and from Iran were celebrating, and he found one of his friends there. So strong friendship, and also there are records of heavy duty investment of Iran in the Israel's development in the past, which still are unaccounted. And in fact, Israel owes a lot of money to Iran, and maybe that's why they are so uh, not hostile, but there are many things. And I hope through these conversations, we are trying to not open the wound, but try to heal the wound, because no one can afford going this way, which is going right now. One of the Canadian diplomats, again, with greetings to you, um, he has said that indeed the Canadian embassy closed in 2012, and attempts to reopen the embassy by the current government in 2017 were voted down in the parliament in 2018. The question is, how do you see the Iran-Turkey relationship playing out in the region, in Syria and Iraq? For example, the bilateral relationship as well.
That's an interesting question. You know, Iran and Turkey have managed to do business with each other almost throughout the Islamic Republic. They're neighboring countries. And you know, there's been Turkish investment in Iran. Iranians can go to Turkey without a visa. So it's one of the places where Iranians from the diaspora will go to meet their relatives who can come out, or at least in the pre-COVID days, could come out from Iran and meet them in Istanbul. And also the beaches of Turkey, very popular holiday places for Iranians who are trying to escape the restrictions of the Islamic Republic and, you know, lie on the beach in a bikini and have a nice glass of wine at the end of the day. There have been some scandals involving money laundering that went on under sanctions. There's an Iranian Turkish banker who was involved in smuggling gold and using Halk Bank as a conduit for hard currency illegally sent to Iran. And I think in Syria, they've worked out a modus vivendi, you know, that the Turks say, look, you leave us in charge of this little piece here. We'll police Idlib and the Sunni fundamentalist crazies in Idlib, in return for which we have some control over how many more refugees come into Turkey, and what happens with the Kurds. We prevent the Kurds from forming their own independent statelet in Syria, or hooking up with Kurds in Turkey and Kurds in Iraq and Kurds in Iran. So you know, Turkey has also tried in the past to be a mediator at various times on the nuclear issue and other issues. Erdogan is very pragmatic, I think, when it comes to Iran, even though Erdogan is a real Sunni Muslim chauvinist and doesn't usually seem to care much about the sufferings of non-Sunnis. He has established a good series of understandings with the Iranians, and of course with the Russians as well. And Iran and Russia have grown much closer as a result of Syria and as a result of the US sanctions, which have kind of pushed them together. And of course, Iran and China, I mean, have developed quite the economic relationship, in part because of the sanctions policy of the United States.
Another question from a Canadian diplomat. To what extent has rapprochement with Iran been sabotaged, not only by John Bolton or Mike Pompeo, by Netanyahu for largely domestic political reasons?
Yeah, well, Netanyahu has been predicting that Iran would get a bomb every year, I think, since 1994. He has used this issue and it's been one constant, frankly, in his terms as prime minister. I'm sure people in the audience remember when he went to the UN General Assembly and he had this kind of crude cartoon of a bomb, it was this round thing with a fuse, and and how much enriched uranium Iran had, and this was the red line, and past that red line, the world would have to act, Israel would have to act. And of course, the Israelis broke into a warehouse in Iran where it had a lot of archives of its mothballed program, its mothballed weapons program. It had a small research program into nuclear weapons that was ended pretty much in 2003 when Iran's activities were exposed, and when Saddam Hussein was overthrown and Iran didn't really need to pursue a bomb anymore. But the Israelis got all these documents and they've been kind of dribbling them out in a very selective fashion to prove that Iran is somehow still harboring, bomb ambitions. And I personally think Iran doesn't want the bomb. It just wants the capacity, which it has already. I mean, if it could make one if it wanted. But the fact that Israel has so penetrated Iran's nuclear infrastructure that it can steal documents, that it can sabotage centrifuges, that it can kill Iranian scientists. There was a bombing at Natanz facility not long ago, which severely damaged a number of centrifuges there yet again. Suggests to me that the Iranians would never get away with a bomb, even if they wanted one. But this, he's dedicated to this, and much of the Israeli intelligence establishment is as well. I have a theory. I mean, yes, it's something he can point to get domestic support, but it's also a way, and has been a way for him to distract attention from Israel's real problem, which is the Palestinian issue and the treatment of Arab Israelis who are discriminated against, the massive flaws in Israel's democracy, which are embarrassing and which are increasingly alienating people, even people who used to support Israel very strongly in the West. So rather than deal with those issues, he says, oh, it's Iran. And I'm sure some of you have seen that with the rockets that Hamas has been firing. There have been people on social media who blame the whole thing on Iran. Well, yes, Iran has helped Hamas, but Hamas apparently now knows how to build these rockets by itself. And most of these are homegrown. And, it wasn't Iran that told the Israelis to evict families from Jerusalem. It wasn't Iran that told the Israelis to invade the Al-Aqsa Mosque and turn off the sound system so it wouldn't interrupt a speech that was being given by an Israeli official, or to put tear gas grenades into the Al-Aqsa Mosque. These are things that Bibi Netanyahu's government did, and the disturbances we've seen in Israeli towns and cities between Jews and Arabs, this has to do with Israel's treatment of the Palestinians, not with anything Iran has done.
Thank you for this observation. I salute you for mentioning that, because there are a lot of progressive American Jews who are recognizing this and now are voicing their concerns. And they're saying that if we say no to you, that doesn't mean we're not sympathetic or don't love Israel. We love Israel, and but what you are doing is damaging what we are calling the democracy in Israel. I mean, it's becoming more and more getting away from the notion of democracy to something else. There is another question from another Canadian diplomat. Surely the hostage crisis did more to poison the US view of Iran than Iran's rhetoric against Israel. Lots of countries rallied against Israel and remained friends with the US, example, Iraq.
Yeah, well, the hostage crisis is the original sin, as far as Americans of a certain age are concerned. But You know, I teach students who, you know, not only don't know anything about the hostage crisis, I mean, they barely understand anything about September 11, 2001. So, you know, I think this is an old memory. The bigger problem is that Iran keeps taking hostages, namely American citizens and dual nationals, and then it uses them and trades them for Iranians who are jailed in the United States. So this image of Iran as a hostage taker is something that unfortunately endures. It's not just in the past. Of course, Iranians have their own grievances against the United States, going back to the coup that deposed Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953 and put the Shah back on the throne. The fact that the US largely sided with Iraq during the Iran-Iraq War, the shoot down of a civilian Iranian airliner in 1988, killing all the innocent people on board. So, you know, we have so many grievances. We've wounded each other so much over the years that at some point we simply have to, you know, forgive each other for our past sins and stop committing new ones if we hope to have a normal relationship.
Thank you. There are many questions, and the Q&A section goes up and down. I lose track of the questions coming in. Another diplomat, what's your assessment of the current Saudi-Iranian talks hosted by Iraq? Do you see any potential hope in it? Does it indicate for any future role Iraq could play in the region?
Yeah, it's frankly the most hopeful thing I've seen happen to Iraq since 2003. This particular prime minister, Kadhimi, who has an intelligence background, is well suited to play a go-between. And it's not just the Saudis and the Iranians. There are also reports that Bill Burns, our former diplomat, now CIA director, also has had some interesting meetings in Iraq, purportedly with Iranians as well. It hasn't been confirmed by the United States, but I wouldn't be surprised if that isn't the case. It used to be that Oman was where people went for these kinds of conversations, but I think Iraq is now the place. It's easy for the Iranians to go there. It's easy for the Saudis to go there. The Iraqis have suffered enormously because of the US-Iran tension has been very destabilizing. And the Saudi-Iran tension also has been very, very destabilizing. Some of the rockets that have hit Saudi Arabia purportedly come from southern Iraq, not just from Yemen. So I'm sure that the talks are about, you know, how can we wind this down? Asking the Saudis to tone down their rhetoric, which they've already done. The Saudis to stop supporting ethnic Arabs in Iran's Khuzestan province. And in Baluchistan, Sunni Arabs that have carried out terrorist attacks against Iranian soldiers and officials. Perhaps telling the Saudis not to give support to this group called the Mujahideen Halq, the MEK, which is a militant dissident Iranian group that had a base in Iraq and is now largely moved out of there. It's been moved to Albania. But the Saudis have supported this group and given it money. And so I think maybe that's another area of conversation. I wrote a piece for the Atlantic Council a while back on what the Middle East needed was a non-subversion pact, where these various regional rivals would agree to stop supporting the enemies of each other. You know, we can see Iranians return to the Hajj. We can see the Saudis perhaps reopen their embassy in Iran, which they closed a few years back. A number of steps that could be taken that would signal a reduction in tensions. The Saudis had a real wake-up call in 2019 when rockets hit their main oil facility and knocked it offline for a couple of weeks. This was Iran's way of retaliating for sanctions, frankly, maximum pressure. It didn't retaliate immediately against the US, it retaliated against the Arabs across the Persian Gulf. And that was a real wake-up call for the Saudis.
Thank you for that. It's interesting that you mentioned Sultan Qaboos and now the role that Iraq is playing. Sultan Qaboos was very gracious, and he always used to say that had it not been for the Iranian soldiers, he would have lost his country. And sometimes Iranians get annoyed with the Saudis because Saudis forget that during the same period, Mr. Kissinger had asked specifically the Iranian military that should anything happen to Saudi Arabia, I expect you to intervene and help the Al Saud family. Anyway, there is another question which is regarding the relationship that you highlighted with Russia. Do you see Russia as a parameter in keeping Iran from the West?
Well, I think the Russians are enjoying, or did enjoy, the Trump administration because it forced Iran to look more toward Russia and China. It spoiled the plans of many in Iran, particularly private business, to get investment from European countries in particular. It showed Iran that the US and Europe could not be trusted, which is, of course, the way Russia feels. I think it's unfortunate that it did push Iran in that direction. But those of you who know Iran's history, know the history of Persia, know that there are long-standing animosities between Persians and Russians, going back to when Tsarist Russia bit off parts of the Persian Empire. Georgia, Azerbaijan, Armenia. These were part of Persia, and Russia took them. And so there's I don't think there's any great love for Russia. And as I mentioned, I don't think the Iranian people identify with Putin's dictatorship. They want more openness. They want more connections with the world. They don't want to be just another pariah state. And Russia under Putin has become a pariah state, unfortunately. So I think this is a temporary alliance of convenience and not one that necessarily will last. The relationship with China is probably will endure longer, I think, than the relationship with Russia.
A question from someone who is doing a lot of academic work pertaining to Iran and the region. Although I hope the current talks lead to a new nuclear deal, the outcome is uncertain. If the talks fail, how do you see relations between Iran and US and Israel developing?
I think it's going to be very bad. I think we're going to see increased tension. I think we're going to see more efforts to push the United States out of Iraq, more rockets falling on bases in Iraq where the US has troops, more tensions with the Israelis, more support for Hezbollah and Hamas, more threats against Israel. There have been some incidents also, I believe, in the Mediterranean, some Israeli shipping that has been attacked, and some Israeli attacks on Iranian shipping. I think we'll see more of this, and it's worrisome. Frankly, it's very worrisome. Plus, Iran will continue to advance its nuclear program, and at some point we may get to that famous red line that Bibi talks so much about. Will the Israelis, if they perceive Iran to have a large stockpile of highly enriched uranium, will the Israelis mount some sort of strike on Iran? So I think it's in everyone's interest to get at least the original JCPOA back, just to reduce tensions and give space for follow-on negotiations.
Thank you. There is one question which maybe it's unfair to ask you, but because we are nonpartisan and all the questions will be answered. Why is Canada not establishing diplomatic relations with Iran? Are we waiting for the US? We lose ground intelligence without diplomats on the ground.
I'm not an expert on Canadian domestic politics, so I can't really give an answer to that, except to say that when I used to go to Iran in the 1990s and the 2000s, I always went to the Canadian embassy. I always spoke with the ambassador or the DCM. I found the level of expertise to be really superb. I don't know if any of the people I met are actually on this call. I'm trying to think of some of the names, but really very, very qualified and talented people. So it's, and it's our loss too as Americans, because we're so close to Canada, and these Canadian diplomats obviously would share a lot of what they learned with American diplomats when they had the opportunity. So I hope that that changes. Fortunately, we still have a lot of Europeans who are in Iran, and the Swiss, of course, who represent the U.S., and so we benefit from that.
Right. And in fact, there was a conference, I think about 2 years ago, this topic was raised at the University of Ottawa. And a number of people were wondering what happened, because the disruption in the relationship between Canada and Iran occurred when Obama was trying to pursue his rapprochement with Iran. And this came out of a blue, and it was primarily due to recommendations or maybe some concerns that was expressed by Mr. Netanyahu. There is a question: what is your assessment of the opposition groups, both within and outside Iran, who call for no to Islamic Republic in the upcoming elections?
Mm-hmm. I think there's a lot of opposition to the regime, both inside and outside. I'm expecting an extremely low turnout in these presidential elections on June the 18th. I think many of the former reformist figures have called, some of them have called for a boycott. The two main candidates so far look to be a man named Ibrahim Raisi, who is the head of the judiciary. He's a cleric, very close to Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader, has an unfortunate record in the 1980s. He was part of a prosecution team that signed off on the execution of 5,000 political prisoners at the end of the Iran-Iraq War. So he's got a lot of blood on his hands. But he seems to be favored now by the conservatives in the system. And then on the other side, you have Ali Larijani, is a former speaker of the parliament, who will be the standard bearer, most likely, for the so-called pragmatist moderate camp. But Larijani is he's not very charismatic. He's experienced. He knows the system well. He has actually more hardline background. He became a defender of the Iran nuclear deal and worked closely with the incumbent president Hassan Rouhani to defend that deal. But he's an academic. He did his doctoral dissertation on Immanuel Kant, very dry character. I don't think he's going to attract terribly much support. And there's an organization called the Guardian Council, which vets all the candidates for elected office, and they're going to eliminate anybody who has any chance of exciting any kind of enthusiasm in these elections. So I would think that turnout may even be below 50%, which will benefit Raisi because his supporters will come out and vote for him. But it's going to be, as many Iranians say, a selection, not an election. And the only silver lining is that if it solidifies control in one camp, it may actually make the Iranian government feel more confident in its ability to negotiate with the United States without worrying that there will be attacks from factional enemies within the system. So we'll see, but it's going to be a very, I think, anticlimactic event.
Thank you. There is a question that you have, I think, responded to it under the title of human rights, but specifically now, I would like to refer to the question here is, as you know, there has been an alarming escalation in both surveillance and persecution of religious minorities, mainly the Baha'is in Iran. And in what way do you think Canada can play a role in urging US, UK, Germany, and France to insist on such a dialogue, considering that there are so many Baha'is, Iranian Baha'is in US, in Canada? And to be honest with you, I don't understand why the current government in Iran has so much animosity toward this group.
Yeah, it's a very unfortunate situation. I think the best way to exert pressure is through multilateral organizations, through the European Union, through the United Nations. There's a special rapporteur for human rights in Iran that the United Nations appoints, who puts out puts out, I think, reports twice a year to shine a light on this terrible persecution is probably the best we can do at this point. There can be sanctions put on individuals within the security establishment who are responsible for prosecutions and for torture of religious minorities. I think the way not to go about it, though, is to punish the entire population of Iran, which is what the current sanctions posture, unfortunately does. We should be very targeted in terms of sanctions against those who are involved in these abuses. As to why Iran, persecutes these people, I mean, this is an issue for the religious establishment there, the Shia establishment, which sees the Baha'is as a renegade breakaway faction that disputes the religious order of Shiism, and it's they're entitled to their view, I suppose, but their treatment of these people is really horrible. They're not allowed to work. They're not allowed to get education, go to university. It's just awful.
Thank you. We're getting close to the end of our program, and I just wanted to ask you a question with which you could almost end the conversation. Given the hardship that people of Iran, the innocent people of Iran, are going through, because we talk about minorities or ill treatment of the minorities, but the fact is that right now the majority, I mean, the minorities included, are going through such a hardship that it's hard to imagine here sitting in North America. And the question is, how can progressive Jews in US help the diaspora Iranians here who have no attachments to the system, who have no association with the current administration in Iran? It's just the same sort of a sympathy that progressive Jews have towards Israel. They may not support the excesses of the government, but they still feel related to the people. It's the same case for the Iranian diaspora in North America who have relatives there and would like to see an end to all these conflicts and the unwanted wars and the fact that we talk about the animosity between Israel and Iran is such an un-Iranian concept when you look at the history and what has been done between the two nations. I read an article that even Ashkenazis have their roots in Iran. I thought before it was all the Mizrahin or Mizrahi, but Ashkenazis have part of their attachments to Iran as well. And historically and genetically, it has been proven. Anyway, I would look forward to your closing remarks now, Barbara.
Sure. Look, there are a number of groups in the United States that work together to get the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action through Congress in 2015. They were brought together by an organization called the Plowshares Fund, which is a nonprofit based in San Francisco that focuses on non-proliferation primarily. It's a wonderful organization. It gives funding for my program and many, many other groups. And there was this consortium of non-proliferation organizations, think tanks, grassroots organizations, and among them was a group called J Street, which is the pro-Israel, pro-peace Jewish organization in the United States. Very progressive, very supportive of the Iran nuclear deal, and very strongly opposed to any kind of war between the United States and Iran, or a war between Israel and Iran. The JCPOA has become a progressive cause. It's also more popular, frankly, now than it was in 2015, and we have Donald Trump to thank for that, because the record of his policies has made everything worse. So even those people who weren't strong supporters of the deal in 2015 now realize that we were better off with it than without it, since Trump was incapable of negotiating anything to replace it, let alone anything better than that. I think we've seen in the reaction of Jews to what's going on in Israel and Gaza now, that there's been a real sea change. The younger generations do not identify with hardline policies. They're not, completely wedded to the Israeli government, right or wrong. They're capable of independent and critical thought, and so they pick and choose. And if you look at some of the people in our Congress, people like Senator Chris Murphy, if you look at even Chuck Schumer, our majority leader, came out the other day and called for a ceasefire between Israel and Gaza, suggesting that he's beginning to feel the heat from his constituents in New York, who are not as pro-Bibi as they used to be. Anyway, there are a number of champions in the Congress, some of them Jewish, some of them not, that really want to see a return to diplomacy with Iran and an end to sanctions that just penalize 80 million people and increase tensions in the region. So this has been a hopeful development. It was a hard 4 years under Trump, extremely painful for many reasons. And, we still have divisions in our country. We still have people who somehow believe that Trump didn't lose. But, mercifully, they're a minority, and I think they're a shrinking minority. And that most Americans are very happy to see the United States get back on the diplomatic path. One final point, and this is one thing that Trump did that, he did take aggressive actions, but he didn't want to have US troops in the Middle East. And we see that the Biden administration is continuing with the drawdown, certainly from Afghanistan, does not want to be dragged into another conflict in the region. And I think that's also perhaps helping countries like Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates realize that they have to come to terms with Iran on their own. They can't count on the United States coming in, in their military defense. So I hope we can get back to diplomacy. I hope we can resolve this terrible situation in Gaza and with Israel, that this can come to a quick end and we can return to the path of diplomacy. And maybe I'll just stop there and thank you all very, very much for your excellent questions and your very kind invitation.
It was a privilege to have you, Barbara. You are a distinguished journalist and a scholar. So it was an insightful conversation, and I hope we can continue this in the future. 80 million Iranians are looking at the Sisters of Esther to rescue them in this process. And so you, Hale, and Wendy, and others should hold the flag for peace.
We'll try.
I thank you. I thank you very much for taking us the opportunity to see you and also speak with you. Thank you.
Welcome. You're welcome.
And thanks to our participants. Khodafiz. And thanks to our participants for supporting us. And I again would like to thank Samuel Amoa, who is behind the scene, and he's providing us with all the technical support. There are a number of accolades coming for you, Barbara, on the system. Everybody is thanking you, and they are happy that you could participate in this program. Thank you again.
Be well.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.